My dad looked me in the eyes and said, "You're not family." She had been staring out of the airplane window for most of the flight, watching the clouds stretch endlessly beneath her, trying to convince herself that this trip meant something. It had been years since she last saw her family properly, years of distance filled with occasional messages that never quite felt real. When the invitation arrived, it didn't feel warm or emotional, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe this time things would be different. Maybe this time she wouldn't feel like an outsider in her own family. So she booked the ticket, packed carefully, and told herself this wasn't about the past, it was about showing up. The venue was exactly what you would expect from a perfect wedding. Long driveway, soft lights wrapped around trees, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a movie rather than real life. Everything about it felt expensive, carefully planned, almost too perfect. She stepped out of the car, smoothing her dress, taking a breath before walking forward. From inside, she could hear music drifting through the doors, soft and elegant, mixed with laughter and the quiet hum of conversation. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something close to happiness. Maybe she had been wrong about everything. She had just reached the entrance when her father stepped in front of her, not rushing, not angry, just deliberate, the kind of movement that makes you stop without thinking. She smiled at first, expecting something normal, maybe a greeting, maybe even an awkward hug. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something flat and distant, and said quietly that she shouldn't be there. It didn't make sense at first. She thought he was joking, or maybe stressed, or maybe there had been some misunderstanding. But he didn't move aside. He didn't soften his tone. He just stood there, blocking the doorway as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Behind him, people continued walking in, dressed beautifully, laughing, completely unaware of what was happening just a few feet away. She caught a glimpse through the glass doors, her sister in white, smiling, surrounded by friends, completely at ease. No hesitation, no confusion, no sign that anything was wrong. Their mother stood further inside, close enough to see everything, far enough to pretend she didn't. No one came out, no one called her name. It slowly settled into something heavier than confusion. This wasn't last-minute chaos or a mistake. This was intentional. Everything about it had been decided before she ever got on that plane. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have, trying to find the right words, trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. But there was nothing to say. The door remained closed, not physically, but in a way that felt much worse. So she turned around, walked back to the car, and sat there in silence while the music continued behind her, as if she had never been part of it at all. On the drive back, the only thought that stayed with her was how easily it had happened, how normal it seemed to them. She told herself that whatever this was, it couldn't get worse than this. She believed that for exactly 3 days. When her phone rang, the tone on the other end was almost ordinary, like nothing unusual had happened. There was no mention of the wedding, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done. Instead, the conversation moved quickly to something else, something practical, something that felt completely disconnected from reality. She listened quietly at first, trying to follow along, until the words finally landed in a way that made everything else disappear. There was a bill, a large one, and somehow it had her name on it. At first, she thought she had misunderstood. She asked simple questions, expecting simple answers, but the more she listened, the less sense it made. She was being told that she had agreed to cover a significant portion of the wedding expenses, that she had signed something, that this responsibility was hers. The certainty in their voices made it sound like a fact, not a discussion. But she knew, without hesitation, that none of it was true. She had never been asked, she had never agreed, she had never signed anything. What followed wasn't a conversation, it was pressure. Calls started coming in from different directions, one after another, all carrying the same underlying message, dressed in slightly different words. Some sounded concerned, others sounded disappointed, but none of them asked what actually happened. They spoke as if the decision had already been made, and she was simply refusing to cooperate. She was reminded of her success, of her stability, of how easily she could solve this problem if she just chose to do it. It was framed as responsibility, as loyalty, as the right thing to do, and every time she tried to explain, it was dismissed before it could fully form. The most unsettling part wasn't the amount of money or even the accusation. It was how normal everyone made it seem, as if expecting her to take on something she never agreed to was completely reasonable, as if her role in the family had always been this, someone who steps in quietly and fixes things without asking questions. When she finally spoke to her sister, hoping for some clarity, something human, the response was colder than she expected. There was no hesitation, no apology, just a simple suggestion that she should pay it and move on, as if the situation didn't require anything more than that. That was the moment everything shifted. The confusion faded, the hurt settled into something quieter, sharper. This wasn't about a misunderstanding or a mistake that could be explained away. This was something planned, something deliberate. Being turned away at the wedding wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of something larger. They hadn't just excluded her, they had already decided what role she would play afterward. And for the first time since she arrived, she stopped trying to make sense of their behavior and started looking at it for what it really was. That was the moment she stopped feeling hurt and started paying attention. She didn't raise her voice again after that last call. There was no point. Whatever explanation she had been hoping for was never going to come, not in a way that made sense, not in a way that respected her. So instead of arguing, she did something far more natural to her. She decided to verify everything. The next morning, she sat at the small desk in her hotel room, laptop open, phone beside her, the silence around her steady and controlled. If her name was truly on something, there would be a record. Contracts didn't exist in conversations or assumptions. They existed on paper, in systems, in files that could be traced. That was something she understood better than anything, so she searched for the venue, found their contact details, and called without overthinking it. Her tone was calm, almost professional, as she introduced herself and asked about the event. There was a brief pause on the other end when she mentioned her name, just long enough to confirm that something had indeed been filed under it. She didn't accuse anyone, didn't mention her family, didn't let any emotion slip into her voice. She simply requested a copy of any agreement connected to her name. The woman on the line explained the process, formal but polite, and told her it would take some time. So she waited. Waiting would have been easier if everything else had stayed quiet, but it didn't. The calls didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent, more pointed. The tone shifted from suggestion to expectation, from expectation to pressure. There were messages about responsibility, about reputation, about how situations like this could damage relationships beyond repair. It was no longer about helping, it was about compliance. And somewhere in between those calls, she learned about the family meeting. It wasn't presented as a confrontation, not officially. It was framed as a conversation, a chance to sit together and resolve things like adults. But she could already see it for what it was, a room full of people who had already decided she was wrong, waiting for her to agree. A controlled environment where the narrative had been set before she even walked in. She didn't decline, she didn't argue, she simply said she would be there. 2 days later, the email arrived. It came quietly, without urgency, just another notification on her phone. But the moment she saw the subject line, everything else seemed to fade. She opened it slowly, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be completely clear, completely present when she read what was inside. The document was attached as a single file. She downloaded it and stared at the screen for a moment before opening it. The first few pages were exactly what she expected. Details about the event, dates, payment terms, structured language that carried no emotion, only obligation. She scrolled carefully, not rushing, letting her eyes move over every line until she reached the section that mattered. Her name was there, printed cleanly, formally, exactly where it would need to be for the responsibility to fall on her. For a second, she just looked at it, not reacting, just observing. Then her eyes moved slightly lower to the signature. She paused. At first glance, it looked right. The shape was familiar, the flow close enough that someone who didn't know better wouldn't question it. But something about it didn't sit properly. It wasn't a thought, it was a feeling, the kind you get when something is almost correct, but not quite. She leaned in slightly, studying it more carefully. The curves were slightly off, the spacing inconsistent, the pressure uneven. It was her name, written in a way that tried to imitate her, but it lacked the natural rhythm of something real. It looked practiced, like someone had taken time to copy it, to study it, to get close enough. Close enough for a stranger, not close enough for her. She didn't need long to understand what she was looking at. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a miscommunication. Someone had taken her name and written it down as if they had the right to. Someone had decided that her identity was something they could use, something they could replicate when it suited them. She sat back slowly, letting that realization settle into something solid and undeniable. They hadn't just assumed she would pay, they had removed her ability to refuse. They had created a version of reality where she was already responsible, where the decision had been made without her. They didn't just expect me to pay, she thought quietly, staring at the screen. They made sure I had no choice. For the first time since all of this started, she felt completely clear. There was no confusion left, no emotional fog, no need to interpret anything. The situation was exactly what it looked like, and now she had something they hadn't expected her to get: proof. She printed the document, then opened her passport and looked at her real signature. Clean, consistent, unmistakably hers. Side by side, the difference was obvious. It didn't require explanation. It didn't require argument. It simply existed. The day of the family meeting arrived quietly. The house was already full when she walked in, the air thick with that particular kind of tension that comes from people preparing to have a conversation they believe they've already won. Conversations paused when she entered, eyes shifting toward her, some curious, some disappointed, most already certain of what they thought. She greeted no one beyond a polite nod and took the empty seat offered to her. The folder in her hands remained closed, resting lightly on her lap. The discussion began almost immediately. It wasn't aggressive at first. It was structured, measured, the kind of tone people use when they believe they are being reasonable. They spoke about responsibility, about family, about how situations like this required maturity and compromise. Her name came up often, always in the context of expectation. She listened without interrupting, without reacting, letting every word settle into the space between them. Then the tone shifted. It became less about discussion and more about conclusion. They spoke as if the outcome was obvious, as if the only thing left was for her to agree. Words like selfish and ungrateful appeared, not shouted but implied strongly enough to be understood. They expected resistance, maybe even emotion. She gave them neither. She waited until the room had said everything it needed to say, until there was nothing left but the silence that follows certainty. Then, calmly, she opened the folder. She didn't rush, she didn't explain, she simply placed the document on the table, turning it so everyone could see. Then she placed her passport beside it, open to the signature. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone leaned forward. Another followed. The room shifted in a way that was almost physical, like the air itself had changed. The comparison didn't require interpretation. The differences were clear, undeniable. Conversations that had been confident seconds earlier dissolved into quiet observation. Her father spoke first, but the certainty in his voice was gone. His words came out uneven, searching for something to hold on to, something to explain what couldn't be explained. Her mother's composure broke quickly after, emotion replacing the structure she had relied on earlier. Her sister said nothing at all, her gaze fixed somewhere far from the table. But it wasn't them that changed the room. It was someone else. A voice that hadn't spoken before, one that carried confusion instead of defense, cut through the silence with a simple question that no one could answer properly. It shifted the weight of the room, pulling it away from accusation and toward reality. And just like that, everything unraveled. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no final argument. The truth didn't need any of that. It sat there on the table, quiet and absolute, doing all the work on its own. She closed the folder after a while, not because she needed to, but because there was nothing left to show. The outcome came later, formally, exactly as it should have. The agreement was declared invalid. The responsibility returned to where it had always belonged. She owed nothing. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel victorious. When she walked out of that house, it wasn't anger she carried with her. It was something much quieter, something final. She understood something then that she hadn't fully accepted before. Being connected by blood didn't give anyone the right to take from her, to decide for her, to use her name as if it belonged to them. Being family didn't mean they got to use you. She stepped outside, the air cool and still, and for the first time since she arrived, she felt completely steady. Not because everything was fixed, but because she finally saw it clearly. And from that day on, nobody ever signed her name again.